She opened the bedroom door at her own wedding anniversary party and saw her husband with her own sister. It was humiliating. But the worst part wasn't that. It was what came to light 4 days later, when police named 3 other women who had been married to this man before her. All 3 had been dead for years. Victoria Larina, 38, owner of a small pastry shop, was celebrating 15 years of marriage to Roman at a country house they'd rented for the occasion. 40 guests, live music, a cake she'd spent 3 days baking herself. In the middle of the evening, when the guests had drifted out to the terrace, Victoria went upstairs to grab a forgotten gift and opened the bedroom door without knocking, a habit she'd blame herself for the rest of her life, because what she saw could never be unseen. Roman and Polina, Victoria's younger sister, 33, the one who'd been raising a toast to a strong family half an hour earlier with tears in her eyes, were caught in the most compromising, no room for excuses position imaginable. The scream that escaped Victoria was heard by the guests downstairs. The scene that followed was loud, public, humiliating to the point of nausea, the kind of thing you see in cheap TV dramas. Except this time, it was her own life, her own home, packed with relatives and friends who witnessed 15 years of marriage collapse in a single second. Polina was sobbing, screaming that she didn't mean for it to happen but couldn't help herself, that she'd loved him for years, even before Victoria married him, a confession that only made things worse. It turned out that all this time, for years, the 2 people closest to Victoria in the world had been carrying on a secret affair behind her back. Roman, unlike the tearful Polina, was disturbingly calm. He didn't make excuses, didn't beg for forgiveness, didn't try to soften the blow. He just said, "Honestly, it's better that you found out yourself." Words that sounded less like remorse and more like relief, the relief of a man who no longer had to pretend. Victoria threw them both out that very night, canceled the rest of the celebration, sent the stunned guests home, and stayed in the empty house alone, surrounded by an uneaten cake and deflated balloons, trying to understand how 15 years of her life could have been so fake. She expected to find nothing in all of this but a sordid, if especially vicious, case of cheating. But the next morning, when she started methodically packing up Roman's things to toss them out the door, she stumbled on his old diary, shoved into the far corner of the closet, a worn, paper-bound notebook with entries from nearly a decade earlier, before they'd even met. Flipping through it out of boredom and anger, Victoria froze at a name that made her stomach drop. Svetlana, anniversary. The date next to it was the same as her and Roman's wedding anniversary, only 7 years earlier. She didn't know any Svetlana. Roman had never once mentioned being married before. With trembling hands, Victoria typed the name into a search along with Roman's surname, which, upon closer reading of old documents, he had apparently changed once, and only slightly, by a single letter, like fixing a typo in a passport. Victoria had never thought to wonder before why a grown man would change the spelling of his own last name. The search turned up a single mention, a short notice in a local district paper from 10 years back. In the settlement of N, a local resident, Svetlana R., 29, tragically died in a fire at her own home. The cause of the blaze was preliminarily attributed to faulty gas equipment. The victim's husband was away on a business trip at the time of the tragedy. Husband. Victoria scrolled through the notice again, looking for the husband's name. No, the paper never mentioned it, but the attached photo of the burned-down house with its charred porch made her blood run cold. In the background of the shot, accidentally caught in the frame, stood a man watching the firefighters, young, but unmistakably recognizable by his features despite the 10 years that had passed and a different haircut. Roman. Victoria didn't rush straight to the police, partly out of shock, partly because she knew that one old newspaper clipping and a matching name in a daily planner weren't enough to build a case on. Instead, she called the only person she trusted in a situation like this, her friend from law school, Oksana, who now worked as an assistant prosecutor in a neighboring region. Oksana listened to the rambling story, the wedding, the affair with the sister, the found article, and took the matter more seriously than Victoria herself had expected. "Do you have any idea how many stories like this end exactly the same way?" Oksana asked the next day, already armed with her own checks through open databases. A man gets married, A few years later, the wife suddenly dies under tragic but formally explainable circumstances. A fire, carbon monoxide poisoning, a drowning accident, and he collects the insurance payout or the inheritance, moves to another city, sometimes tweaks his last name, and finds a new victim. It's called the Black Widower pattern, and cases like this almost never make it to court precisely because each individual incident looks like a tragic accident, not a crime. Oksana ran Roman through every database she could access, pulling every string she had within the system, and what she uncovered over the next 3 days turned Victoria's personal drama into something far beyond a family tragedy. Roman's real name, according to archival civil registry records from another region, had indeed been changed, not once, but twice over the past 15 years, each time with small variations, enough to confuse a surface-level background check, but not enough to fool a targeted dig through the archives. Under his first name, he had been married to that very Svetlana, who died in the fire 10 years ago. 2 years after her death, now under a slightly altered name, he remarried, a woman named Natalia, who, as the check revealed, had died 4 years into the marriage from acute poisoning by an unidentified substance, diagnosed posthumously as presumably spoiled food. Her case had also been closed without criminal charges. And another year after that, already under the name Roman, he married Victoria. 3 wives, 2 deaths. 1, Victoria, still alive. When Oksana spoke those numbers aloud over the phone, Victoria felt the ground literally fall out from under her. Because behind the bare statistics, a question suddenly surfaced that she hadn't even thought of until that moment. Why, in 15 years of marriage to her, had nothing of the sort ever happened? Why was she the one who'd survived, if this really was a pattern that had repeated itself over and over with almost mechanical precision? The answer, cynical as it might sound, came from Oksana herself. Maybe because Roman wasn't ready yet, hadn't finished his preparations, whether financial, tied to insurance and shared property, or emotional, tied to lining up a new, more convenient replacement, who could very well be Polina, Victoria's younger sister, already woven deep enough into his life to become the next wife after a divorce, rather than after a tragedy. That thought made Victoria shudder with a whole new kind of horror, because if Oksana was right, then her own sister, however treacherously she'd behaved at the anniversary party, was now in far greater danger than Victoria herself, who had only just escaped the fate of the previous wives, precisely because she'd caught him cheating before Roman could see his plan through. Victoria, swallowing her own resentment, dialed Polina's number for the first time in 4 days of silence since the blow-up. The conversation took a physical toll. Her voice shook. Her stomach churned at the sound of her sister's voice. But she forced herself to say what mattered most. "Polina, you're in danger. Get away from him, now, before it's too late. I'll explain everything, just leave right now." Polina, still convinced her sister was calling to make threats or manipulate her, hung up without listening. Victoria called back an hour later, and again, and on the third attempt, hearing genuine, primal terror in Victoria's voice, Polina finally agreed to hear the whole story out. The resolution came fast, almost theatrically, as if fate itself had decided to confirm the sisters' worst fears at the very last possible moment. That same evening, while Victoria and Polina, old grievances set aside, sat together in their mother's kitchen trying to figure out what to do next, the phone rang. It was Polina's neighbor, frightened and frantic, saying the lights were on in Polina's apartment, strange sounds were coming from inside, and Roman's car had been parked outside the entrance for nearly 2 hours, even though Polina, as the neighbor understood it, was supposed to have been at her mother's place since that morning. Panicking, Polina called her own mobile phone, which, as it turned out, she'd left at home, but no one answered. Victoria, without a moment's hesitation, didn't call the police. She called Oksana directly, knowing she'd react faster than any dispatch unit, and laid out the situation in 30 seconds flat, crystal clear. The police unit, dispatched on priority by Oksana's call thanks to her position, arrived at Polina's address 17 minutes later. What they found inside confirmed the worst-case scenario. Roman had broken into the apartment of the absent Polina and was waiting inside for her to return, surrounded by the traces of preparations that investigators would later classify as an attempt to stage an accident. a gas hose at the stove connected improperly, the telltale smell of a leak already seeping through the kitchen, and an open window, clearly left that way on purpose, so that in case of fire it would plausibly look as though the owner herself had simply forgotten to turn off the gas before she left. Roman didn't resist arrest, and, what surprised even hardened operatives, he started talking almost immediately. Not like a man crushed under the weight of evidence, but like someone exhausted from carrying the same cold, well-rehearsed scheme inside him for decades. He confirmed the death of his first wife, Svetlana, calling it not murder, but inevitability, and he explained his logic with a chilling, emotionless directness. The insurance payouts and inherited property after each tragedy let him start his life over without a care. And since none of the three wives had children, right up to the present day, there were no awkward questions from the relatives of the deceased, who were far too consumed by grief to look for hidden motives where everything pointed to a tragic accident. As for the death of his second wife, Natalia, from poisoning, Roman didn't try to deny that either. He stated the dosage of the substance he'd added to her favorite dish the night before she died, with the same tone a person might use to describe the recipe itself, a detail that sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. The only thing he stumbled over, and clearly lied to the investigation about, was why Victoria, wife number 3, was still alive after 15 years of marriage, far longer than the previous two. The version the investigation eventually settled on, after combing through the family's financial records, turned out to be almost more cynical than the murders themselves. Victoria's pastry shop, which she'd spent years building practically from nothing, had operated at a loss for its first 8 years, and only in the last 3 had it started bringing in steady, growing income. Which is exactly why Victoria's death, had it come any earlier, simply wouldn't have brought Roman any real financial gain, unlike the fate of his previous 2 wives, each of whom already had solid savings or property at the time of her death. He waited, methodically, for years, until his wife's business grew to the amount he needed, and in parallel, he was building a relationship with Polina as a faster, emotionally manageable replacement in case the Victoria plan fell through for some reason or dragged on longer than he'd calculated. It was this openly cynical confession that her 15 years of marriage were nothing more than a calculation of when the investment would finally pay off that proved more terrifying for Victoria than the affair with her own sister. More terrifying, even, than the threat to her own life. She had married for love. She had built a shared way of life with this man, a shared business, shared dreams. And for him, the entire time, it was a financial project with a pre-planned, simply delayed, lethal outcome. Digging deeper into Roman's biography, the investigation established that his first name change had happened before he even married Svetlana, which means it's still unknown whether she truly was the first victim of this scheme, or whether, somewhere at the very beginning, under yet another, third name, there was another woman. Her fate has not been established to this day, and investigators are actively searching through the archives of the regions where, according to indirect evidence, Roman lived in his youth. Polina, who miraculously escaped becoming the 4th victim, had cut off all ties with Roman long before the trial, and, contrary to what many expected, she eventually rebuilt her relationship with her sister. Not right away. It was hard, and it took months of joint therapy and difficult conversations. But she did rebuild it, united with Victoria by a common enemy far more terrifying than any mutual resentment over betrayal. As of the publication of this story, the case of a possible 4th victim, a woman whose fate has yet to be determined, remains open.